Is this on? There it is. Hey everybody, my name is Brad Werner. Yeah, it's there. Okay. And I'm a scientist coming from San Diego in the States. It's a little bit warmer. But I work on researching how humans and the environment interact. And the next slide, please. In the other part of my life, I do a bit of activism, and down there by in the shadow of the Mexico-U.S. border, where there are numerous injustices. And I just want to give a shout out to some of the organizations and people I work with in San Diego who have taught me a lot more than I ever learned in a classroom. So next slide, please. Today, I want to talk a bit about basically how science, or one view from science of the role of resistance in the future of the Earth and its relationship to the human relationship to the environment. Basically, I want to talk a bit about how the structures in our society are failing to address some of the looming issues that are coming to the fore, such as climate, biodiversity, soils and water, and what role resistance can play in filling the gaps that dominant culture are leaving behind. So in the next slide, I want to talk, I'm an academic, and I'm sorry we're going to start a little bit slow, a little bit academic-y. And so I want to introduce a concept, an academic concept. It's called dissipation. And basically, it sort of starts out when something is going on some trajectory and it gets diverted or disrupted. So you can think of a pinball, a pinball machine, a ball going down a pinball machine on its trajectory, and all of a sudden it hits a bumper and then hits another bumper and so forth. So those, talking about those kinds of diversions. And when you add them up over a period of time, you end up with dissipation. And dissipation has the effect of mixing and also reducing differences. So mixing like in a blender, or reducing differences, say in the velocity of birds in a flock, in a V formation. Basically there's some sort of dissipative interaction that's reducing those velocities that allow the birds to fly together. And the overall impact of dissipation has two very robust and well-known effects. One is dissipation increases stability. So you can take a system that seems fairly unstable, and if you introduce this dissipation, it'll stabilize it. The other thing that dissipation can do, especially in a human context, is it can strengthen the connections between different scales, like between the individuals in a community and the community, and between the community and the overall culture. Dissipation acts to strengthen those connections. So what I'd like to do now, starting the next slide, is talk a little bit about the dominant culture, the economic and political culture in which we are embedded, and what role dissipation plays or doesn't play in its relationship to the environment. So we think about markets and economics and their relationship to the environment. Basically, they try to use technology to facilitate that relationship, to mine minerals, to cut down forests or whatever. Technology enables the placing of nature, of the environment into this category of natural resources and exploiting them. And basically, what you're doing when you're facilitating something, when you're making it easier, is you're getting rid of all those disruptions, all those bumps, and so you're reducing the dissipation. And when you reduce the dissipation, well, we know what happens. We know that the system, which might have been stable before, is going to become unstable. So basically, by the markets and their use of technology reducing dissipation in humanity's relationship to the environment, they're destabilizing our relationship to the environment. So the markets will exploit one resource very quickly and then jump to another one, or if there's a better alternative, they'll jump to that. They're very unstable. The other thing that happens is the reduction of dissipation enables the markets to make that connection to the environment much faster. So everything becomes much faster. When it used to be when you wanted to communicate with someone far away, you'd write them a letter, and now you just send them a text. So in the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about, we could think of, well, okay, that's what the markets do, but what about the political system? Can't it fix it? Can't it make things more stable? And the answer is pretty much it does the same thing. It uses technology, and it uses many of the same techniques that the economic system uses, like calculations like cost-benefit analyses, which are very much like profit calculations, to manage the environment. The only thing that's kind of constraining the political system is that it has to, instead of like looking at one resource, one company looking at one resource, it's managing a regional economy or a global economy. And so basically, the political system is pretty much doing the same thing, it's just a little bit more constrained. And so it's creating instabilities as it's using technology to relate and manage the environment. And sometimes it will take action, like in building levees in flood-prone areas like New Orleans. But for problems that have longer time scales like climate change, it will basically just ignore them. So next slide, please. So now I'd like to address basically this issue of, well, from what I've said up to this point, you might say, well, we're fucked. But what else is there? And the other thing that is there is resistance. It's people stepping outside the bounds of the dominant culture. And basically resistance movements, social movements are often spawned in the wreckage that is left behind in the instabilities that the economic and political system create. So going to the next slide, let's just briefly look at how we can analyze resistance and social movements in terms of this concept of dissipation. So looking over the short term, resistance movements engage in actions and protests and direct action of various kinds. In response, the dominant culture says, hey, you're stepping outside the bounds of my culture, so we're going to pepper spray you or whatever. And over the short term, those actions might nudge the dominant culture in the direction that you want, and sometimes they don't. But in any case, those actions are disruptive to the dominant culture. They're diverting the dominant culture from the direction it wants to go, even if only temporarily. And if we think about what effect that has over the longer time scales, over the longer term, the dominant culture, of course, in addition to pepper spraying, has other tricks up its sleeve, including co-opting elements of the resistance. And we all know of, can think of organizations which essentially started off as radical, useful organizations and became co-opted. But the other thing that's happening over the longer term is that those little disruptions for individual resistance movements or protests basically add up to create dissipation. And so resistance movements are injecting dissipation into the dominant culture. And what dissipation does then is acts as a stabilizing force. And so resistance movements are injecting dissipation into the dominant culture and promoting stability or the potential for a sustainable relationship to the environment. Next slide. So what does this mean then in terms of activism? And the first point is that basically, as I discussed, it seems that the dominant culture, the economic and political components of it, do not have the capability to address the issue of sustainability. The card they have up their sleeve is technology, but technology, because it facilitates, because it makes things easier, it actually, over the long term, destabilizes the human relationship to the environment. So basically, activism, which has the potential to inject stabilizing dissipation into the environment, is it. And so basically my message to you is you are the only hope for creating a sustainable relationship to the environment. The second thing I just want to point out is that even though oftentimes, I don't know, how many people here have participated in an action which did not achieve its goals? Okay, so that has happened to me pretty much in every action I participated in, and it's kind of discouraging, but the message here from this kind of scientific analysis of resistance is that even if you don't achieve your goals, the disruption that you're causing is still injecting dissipation into the dominant culture, and it is still bringing us closer to a sustainable relationship to the environment. Thank you.